Welcome to Lesson 2, Schizophrenia, Biological Explanations for Schizophrenia. My name is Nick Redshaw and I have over 16 years experience of teaching A-level psychology. I'm also co-author of the highly successful independent learner series of student workbooks, available exclusively on Amazon. So looking at the learning objectives for this session, on completion of this section you should be familiar with research into the biological explanations for schizophrenia, genetics, the dopamine hypothesis, and neural correlates. The biological approach assumes that schizophrenia can be explained in the same way as physical illness, that is, in terms of biological or physical causes. This unit will look at the main biological explanations for schizophrenia. So firstly, the biological explanations for schizophrenia. According to the main assumptions of the biological approach, schizophrenia is caused by genetics, neurochemical imbalances, the dopamine hypothesis, and or brain structures, neural correlates. As you can see from the diagram, you've got genetics, neurochemical imbalances, and brain structure. If you're using one of our workbooks, or if your teacher has downloaded our workbook from TESS, please complete the following question. If you haven't got one of our workbooks, on a piece of paper, complete the following question. Explain what is meant by the term nature in the nature versus nurture debate in relation to biological explanations for schizophrenia. You may want to pause the video at this point in order to answer the question. Okay, welcome back. So, for 2 marks, simply the nature-nurture debate is a philosophical argument between those psychologists who believe that behavior is influenced by innate biological factors known as nature. In relation to schizophrenia, they believe the condition is caused by genetics, biochemical imbalances, or differences within structures of the brain, and those who believe the behavior is a result of external environmental factors is known as nurture. So, the genetic explanation for schizophrenia. Although statistics show that only 1 in 100 people will develop schizophrenia, researchers found that a high proportion of people with schizophrenia have a parent or close relative with the disorder. So according to the biological approach, this would indicate that there is a genetic cause to schizophrenia. Much of the research into genetic explanations for schizophrenia come from twin and family studies and adoption studies. Twin studies. Research carried out by Gottsman in 1991 found that the risk of developing schizophrenia increases depending on how closely they are biologically related to the person suffering from schizophrenia. The table below shows the likelihood of developing schizophrenia based on the amount of genes shared. So, the table, relative with schizophrenia and the chance of developing schizophrenia. Relative with schizophrenia, none, 1 in 100, i.e. the general population. Parent, 1 in 10. Identical twin, 1 in 2, 50%, and non-identical twins, 1 in 8. So, in your workbook, outline what the data in the table above tells us about the genetic explanation for schizophrenia. So this is 4 marks. Basically, you just need to explain the table and then what it means in relation to the genetic explanation. You may want to pause the video at this point in order to answer the question. Okay, welcome back. Research carried out by Gottsman in 1991 found that the risk of developing schizophrenia increases depending on how closely they are biologically related to the person suffering from schizophrenia. The table shows the likelihood of developing schizophrenia is higher in identical MZ twins, with a 1 in 2 chance, i.e. 50%, followed by non-identical twins, based on the number of genes shared, with a 1 in 8, i.e. 12.5% chance, whereas those sharing no genes have a very little chance, 1 in 100, thus suggesting there is a genetic link in the development of schizophrenia. Further research by Cadno in 2002 found that 26.5% of monozygotic twins both suffered from schizophrenia, compared to 0% for dizygotic twins. Twin studies appear to have validity as all these findings are higher than 1% in the general population of developing schizophrenia, therefore suggesting there is a genetic link. However, although the research shows an increased risk of family members developing schizophrenia, it is not sufficient to support the conclusion that genetic factors alone cause schizophrenia. If this was the case, the concordance rate of MZ twins should be 100%. So in ignoring other factors that may cause schizophrenia, such as environmental factors, the biological explanation can be regarded as reductionist. As monozygotic twins are often treated identically by their families, making them more likely to copy and imitate each other, there is a greater risk that they will both be diagnosed as suffering from schizophrenia. This suggests there is both a genetic and environmental explanation of why schizophrenia occurs. This is known as the diathesis stress model, where someone who has a genetic predisposition to develop schizophrenia is exposed to an environmental trigger. In your workbooks, if you'd like to complete the following activities, and you may want to pause the video at this point. So, welcome back. Explain the genetic difference between monozygotic and dizygotic twins. So for 2 marks, twins can be either monozygotic, identical, meaning that they develop from one zygote, one egg fertilized by one sperm cell, which splits and forms 2 embryos, or dizygotic, fraternal, meaning that they develop from 2 different eggs. In fraternal twins, each twin is fertilized by its own sperm cell. And the 4-mark question, describe how the findings from twin studies have been used to show how the role of genetics provides an explanation for schizophrenia. Research carried out by Gottsman in 1991 found that the risk of developing schizophrenia increases depending on how closely they are biologically related to the person suffering from schizophrenia, with the likelihood of developing schizophrenia being much higher in identical MZ twins, with a 1 in 2 chance, 50%, followed by non-identical twins based on the number of genes shared, 1 in 8 chance, 12.5%, whereas those sharing no genes has very little chance, 1 in 100, thus suggesting there is a genetic link in the development of schizophrenia. Further research by Cadno found that 26.5% of monozygotic twins both suffered from schizophrenia, compared to 0% of dizygotic twins. Twin studies appear to have validity, as all these findings are higher than the 1% risk in the general population developing schizophrenia, therefore suggesting there is a genetic link. Adoption studies. As we have already mentioned, it is difficult to remove the possibility that environmental factors may be causing schizophrenia and not genetics, as twins are usually brought up together. The way researchers try to eliminate these factors is through the use of twin studies that looks at twins born to schizophrenic mothers but who have been raised separately. An early study by Heston in 1966 found that 16% of born to 47 schizophrenic mothers and adopted at a very early age developed the condition. This percentage is well above 1%, so supports the biological assumption there is a genetic link. Ketty and Tineri found that when all other factors were matched, the rates of schizophrenia among the adoptees were 10% higher in those patients whose biological mothers suffered from schizophrenia, compared to 1% of those who without schizophrenic mothers. These studies show a strong genetic cause for schizophrenia. Ideally, a study that looked at identical twins with schizophrenia raised apart would be the best evidence. However, such cases would be very rare and findings and conclusions would be limited by sample size. Advances in medicine and genetic testing is now allowing researchers to study the link between genetics and schizophrenia more accurately, and a recent study by Pocklington in 2014 at Cardiff University compared the genetic data of 11,355 patients with schizophrenia against a control group of 16,416 people without the condition. They found that the genetic variation existed in the brain and in the immune system of the schizophrenia patients, further supporting the link between genetics and schizophrenia. This type of study is able to identify small variations in genes, presents more frequently in people with a particular disease, compared with people without the disease. But it is only able to show an association and cannot prove that the genetic variation found caused the disease. So in your independent learner workbooks, if you'd like to complete the following tasks. So if you'd like to pause the video at this point. So, many of the studies that look at the role of genetics in explaining schizophrenia show a link between genetics and schizophrenia. Name the research method. Well, here, they're natural experiments, because they're looking at schizophrenia in a naturally occurring environment and then comparing it with people that aren't. So it's an experiment, but carried out in a natural environment. Outline one strength and one limitation of using this research method when looking at the role of genetics in explaining schizophrenia. So, strengths and weaknesses of natural experiments. You need one strength from the following. A natural experiment enables us to research behaviours that could not otherwise be investigated experimentally because it involves a naturally occurring independent variable, in this case schizophrenia in twins. This means it can be used to investigate phenomena which would not be practical or ethical to manipulate in a laboratory or field experiment where the IV is controlled more. The natural experiment takes place in a natural setting. So another strength is the natural experiment takes place in a natural setting, the twins' home environments, and so usually has greater mundane realism than the controlled environments of lab experiments, and consequently may have greater generalizability to real life, and so high external validity. Weaknesses, one from the following limitations of natural experiments: control over extraneous variables. For example, the twins share the same environment and are probably treated the same, so it may not be genetics but the way they are brought up that may be causing the schizophrenia, so cause and effect cannot be directly inferred, making internal validity very low. Ethical issues are similar to that of field experiments, i.e. in this case informed consent, right to withdraw or debriefing, and you need to shape it to the fact that those suffering from schizophrenia are vulnerable groups, so needs to ensure that they are fit to give informed consent, etc. Okay, moving on, the dopamine hypothesis. If biological factors do have a role in causing people to develop schizophrenia, then biochemical abnormalities may provide an appropriate explanation into the cause of schizophrenia. Iverson in 1979 put forward the suggestion that there is a relationship between the neurotransmitters dopamine and schizophrenia. Further research carried out in the area claimed that schizophrenic behavior is a result of producing too much dopamine, or the oversensitivity of brain neurons to dopamine. This became known as the dopamine hypothesis. And as you can see from the screen, evidence for the role of dopamine is outlined below. Recreational drugs such as amphetamines increase dopamine production and produce hallucinations and other psychotic-like experiences, similar to those suffered by schizophrenics. Also, using neuroleptic drugs blocks dopamine at the synapse and helps to reduce the symptoms of schizophrenia. Post-mortem examinations have shown that there are many more dopamine receptors in the brains of schizophrenics. Neuroimaging has also revealed that people suffering from schizophrenia have substantially more dopamine receptors than people who do not have the condition. Parkinson's disease is known to be related to low dopamine levels, and one symptom is abnormal movement, which is also a symptom associated with schizophrenia. So in your independent learner workbooks, explain how the dopamine hypothesis supports the biological explanation for 6 marks. Explain how the dopamine hypothesis supports the biological explanation for schizophrenia, and welcome back. So, the biological approach assumes that schizophrenia can be explained in the same way as physical illness, that is, in terms of biological or physical causes. If biological factors do have a role in causing people to develop schizophrenia, then biochemical abnormalities may provide an appropriate explanation into the cause of schizophrenia. Iverson in 1979 put forward the suggestion that there is a relationship between the neurotransmitter dopamine and schizophrenia. Further research carried out in this area claimed that schizophrenic behavior is a result of producing too much dopamine, or the oversensitivity of brain neurons to dopamine. This became known as the dopamine hypothesis, and clearly supports the role of biological explanations in causing schizophrenia. And from the previous slide, you need to provide 1 or 2 examples of the evidence, i.e. the recreational drugs, the neuroleptic drugs that block dopamine, post-mortem examinations, the neuroimaging that shows that schizophrenics have more dopamine receptors, and people suffering from Parkinson's disease. So, moving on. Although there is strong empirical evidence to support the role of dopamine in schizophrenic behavior, there are issues with the dopamine hypothesis. Neuroleptic drugs do not work for all patients diagnosed with schizophrenia, suggesting that it's not just dopamine that causes schizophrenic behaviours. It fails to explain why symptoms only improve gradually when patients take appropriate drugs, despite them having an immediate effect on dopamine levels in the brain. Drugs such as clozapine do not block dopamine at the synapse, but are just as effective at dealing with the symptoms of schizophrenia. Brain scans carried out in the 1990s have not found that people suffering from schizophrenia have more dopamine receptors. The neurotransmitters serotonin and noradrenaline may also play a role in psychotic experiences, so the dopamine explanation may be too simplistic. It is clear that there is some evidence for a biochemical explanation of schizophrenia. However, it is a complex area and more research is needed in this area to pinpoint the exact role that certain chemicals play in the cause of the condition. Okay, your homework independent task is: it is possible that medication usually given to help people experience the symptoms associated with schizophrenia may be responsible for the chemical changes observed. Discuss this statement in relation to the dopamine hypothesis for 10 marks. So you may want to pause here. You want to spend about 15 minutes to 20 minutes having a go at this, and these are really, really important. 4 marks of AO1, 6 marks of AO3, 4 marks of description, 6 marks of evaluation. So discuss this statement in relation to the dopamine hypothesis. Okay, welcome back. So for 10 marks, although there is strong empirical evidence to support the role of dopamine in schizophrenia, there are issues with the dopamine hypothesis. Neuroleptic drugs do not work on all patients diagnosed with schizophrenia, suggesting that it's not just dopamine that causes schizophrenic behaviour. That's 2 marks. It fails to explain why symptoms only improve gradually when patients take appropriate drugs, despite them having an immediate effect on dopamine levels. That's 2 marks. Drugs such as clozapine do not block dopamine at the synapse, but are just as effective at dealing with the symptoms of schizophrenia. 2 marks. Brain scans carried out in the 1990s have not found that people suffering from schizophrenia have more dopamine receptors. The neurotransmitters serotonin and noradrenaline may also play a role in psychotic experiences, so the dopamine explanation may be too simplistic. It is clear that there are some evidence for biochemical explanations of schizophrenia. However, it's a complex area and more research is needed in this area to pinpoint the exact role that certain chemicals play in the cause of the condition. So finally, neural correlates. The term neural correlates refers to the study of the brain activity and how it causes and affects a particular condition or experience. Neuroscientists have looked at the brains of schizophrenic patients and compared them to the brains of controls to see if there are differences in terms of their anatomical structure or cell count that can explain the causes and symptoms of schizophrenia. Schwarze and Anderson in 1990 looked at the brains of 50 schizophrenics and found that they had abnormally large lateral ventricles, fluid-filled cavities due to brain cell loss, when compared to those who did not have schizophrenia. Sudath in 1990 used MRI to investigate MZ twins, where just one twin had schizophrenia. They found that most, but not all, of the schizophrenic twins had enlarged lateral ventricles, providing strong evidence in support of Schwarze and Anderson's findings that there is a relationship between brain structure and schizophrenia. Neuroimaging studies carried out by Jernigan in 1991 found unusual cell connections in the hippocampus of schizophrenic patients and a significant cell loss in the structures of their limbic systems. In addition, imaging techniques were used by Liddell in 1996 to demonstrate that people suffering from schizophrenia have underactive temporofrontal areas compared with controls without schizophrenia. It has also been suggested by Crow in 1985 that schizophrenia is a neurodevelopment disorder that arises as a result of factors that occur either while the baby is still in the womb or during complications at birth. Crow argues that these factors can lead to neuropsychological deficits that explain why some people develop schizophrenia gradually over a long period of time and display negative symptoms such as apathy or social withdrawal. Neural correlates may point towards differences in brain structures as an explanation for schizophrenia. However, it is not clear exactly which of the structures and processes are responsible Further research has shown that people without schizophrenia also have enlarged ventricles, which contradicts the findings of Swasey and Anderson's and Sudath's studies. In addition, there is a lack of consistency in the brain structures studied, so it is very difficult to establish the exact nature of the brain abnormality of schizophrenics. The main problem with looking at brain structure as an explanation of schizophrenia is that we cannot be sure of the changes in the brain is causing schizophrenia, or if it was the other way round, i.e. the schizophrenia causing the changes. As a result, conclusive evidence of cause and effect cannot be inferred, only that there is an association between brain structure and schizophrenia. It is far more likely that schizophrenia can be explained through a combination of environmental factors that bring about the onset of schizophrenia and biological factors contributing towards a person's likelihood of developing the condition. Okay, so your final homework independent task is discuss biological explanations for schizophrenia, and this is 16 marks. 6 marks of AO1, 10 marks of AO3. Okay, so you may want to pause the video and spend about 25 to 30 minutes on this, although in the exam you'll have about 16 to 20 minutes. Okay, welcome back. So, 16 marks, your possible content, your AO1 content, genetic explanations, potential genetic mechanisms, dopamine hypothesis as we've discussed in this section, other neurotransmitters, serotonin, and so on, neural correlates, decreased ventricle, etc. And possible discussion points, use of evidence to support, refute, i.e. the MZ twin research that we've discussed in this session, other concordance rates, pharmaceutical action, effective antipsychotic drugs, MRI, scanning studies, comparison with psychological explanations, i.e. family-based explanations, which we'll look at in the next unit, value of the diathesis stress approach, i.e. environmental factors and biological factors, implications, i.e. determinism, identification, consequences for treatment should also be discussed here, and issues relating to the diagnosis and classification could also be sort of used here. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson for the psychological explanations of schizophrenia.